the cold, forgotten annals of history, nestled between epics of fire and steel, lies the kingdom of Eridor. It is a name whispered only by the wind that howls through its skeletal ruins, a testament to a crown built on ambition and cemented with sorrow. The grand palace, now a hollowed-out carcass of marble and gold, once pulsed with life, with intrigue, and with a darkness that coiled in its shadowed corners like a sleeping serpent. This is not a story of valiant knights or benevolent rulers. It is a tragic tale of a king who craved a legacy, a queen who carried a curse, and a princess who was born only to pay the price for their sins. It is the story of a family ensnared by fate, whose love was as sharp and as deadly as a dagger in the dark, and whose final, desperate moments played out behind an impassive, unyielding door of cold, black iron. The stones of Eridor remember. They remember the opulence, the whispers, and the blood. They remember the promise of a golden age that curdled into a nightmare, leaving behind nothing but an echo of despair, and the haunting legend of the girl who never saw the sun. The man who would be king was not born to a throne. He carved one from the bones of his rivals. He was a lord of the lesser houses, a man named Kalen, with eyes like chips of flint and an ambition that burned hotter than any forge. He rose through the ranks on a tide of broken promises and timely assassinations, his charisma a velvet glove over an iron fist. He saw weakness as a plague and mercy as its symptom, and he purged the land of both with ruthless efficiency. When he finally seized the capital, his coronation was not a celebration but a warning. The crown was not placed upon his head, it was hammered into place, a symbol of a power taken, not given. The kingdom, weary from civil war, bowed to its new master, mistaking his cruelty for strength. They cheered his name in the streets, unaware that the foundation of his new dynasty was laid upon a secret so dark it would poison the very soil of the land. The king had his kingdom, his power absolute. But power, he would learn, is a thirsty god, and it would soon demand a sacrifice far greater than the blood he had already spilt. To solidify his reign, the king needed a queen, a symbol of grace and legitimacy to soften the hard edges of his conquest. He found her across the sea, in a kingdom of mist and ancient pacts. Her name was Lyra, a princess whose beauty was the stuff of minstrels' songs, with hair like spun moonlight and eyes the color of a twilight storm. Their wedding was a spectacle of impossible grandeur, a feast that lasted a fortnight, designed to dazzle the world and erase the bloody memory of the king's ascension. But beneath the silk and jewels, the queen was a political prisoner, her hand traded for a fragile peace treaty. She arrived in Eridor not as a bride, but as a beautiful, gilded offering. The crowd saw a radiant queen, but in the quiet moments in the cold reflection of the palace mirrors, she saw only a captive. The king saw her not as a wife, but as the perfect ornament for his throne and the future mother of a pure-blooded heir, a vessel for the legacy he so desperately craved to create, unaware that she had brought with her a shadow from her own land, a secret sorrow that would one day unravel them all. A year to the day of the queen's arrival, the bells of the capital rang out, announcing the birth of a royal heir. But the joy was short-lived, for the child was not the son the king had demanded of the heavens. It was a daughter, Princess Alara. She was a child of ethereal beauty, inheriting her mother's moonlit hair and a silence that seemed ancient and profound. The king, masking his bitter disappointment, presented her to the court as the jewel of Eridor. Yet from her first breath, an unspoken omen clung to the princess. Astrologers whispered of a starless sky on the night of her birth, of a comet that had vanished as she entered the world. The queen held her daughter close, a fierce, protective love burning in her eyes, as if she could shield the innocent child from a fate already written. The king, however, saw the princess less as a daughter and more as another asset, another piece in his grand design. He ordered the construction of the most lavish royal nursery in history, but its windows were barred with intricate golden filigree, and its heavy oak door was soon replaced by one of cold, unforgiving iron. The gilded halls of the palace began to feel like a mausoleum. A creeping paranoia took root in the king's heart, and the shadows in the corridors seemed to lengthen and twist into accusatory shapes. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously, for the king's spies were everywhere. They whispered of the queen's profound melancholy, how she would wander the castle gardens alone, a ghostly figure in the twilight. They spoke of the princess, a girl seen only in fleeting glimpses, a pale face at a high window, her existence more rumor than reality. The iron door to her chambers was always locked, attended by guards who never spoke. It was said the king allowed only himself and the queen to pass through it, keeping his jewel protected from the world. But was it protection, or was it imprisonment? The laughter that should have echoed through the royal wing was replaced by an oppressive silence, a quiet so deep it felt heavy, suffocating. The palace was no longer a home. It had become a cage, for the queen, for the court, and most of all, for the lonely princess behind the iron door. The king's ambition was a ravenous beast, never satisfied. Having secured his borders, he looked outward, dreaming of an empire that would make the gods themselves tremble. He levied crushing taxes upon his people to fund his ever-expanding armies, replacing fields of wheat with sprawling military encampments. Granaries emptied, while the royal treasury overflowed with gold destined for sword and spear. The king saw his daughter, Princess Alara, as the ultimate bargaining chip for this future empire. He envisioned her married to a powerful foreign emperor, a living seal on an alliance forged in his image. He would visit her in her isolated chambers, showering her with priceless gems and intricate toys, not out of fatherly affection, but as a craftsman polishes his finest work before a sale. The queen would watch these encounters with a silent dread, seeing the cold, calculating ambition in her husband's eyes. He did not see a child, he saw a key. The princess, in her innocence, saw only her father, a towering figure who brought her beautiful, cold things, unaware that each gift was another link in the chain that bound her to his monstrous and bloody ambitions. While the king plotted his wars, the queen waged a silent one within the castle walls. Her spirit, once as bright as her famed beauty, was eroding under the weight of her gilded captivity and the king's glacial indifference. He was a husband in name only, a cold presence who shared her bed but never her heart. Her only solace, her only reason for enduring the endless, lonely days was the princess. The few hours she was permitted to spend with Alara behind the iron door were a desperate gasp of air for a drowning woman. She would read to her, sing ancient lullabies from her homeland, and tell her stories of a world of sunlit meadows and open seas, a world her daughter would never know. But the queen carried a heavier burden than just a loveless marriage. She knew the true source of the king's power, the dark pact he'd made to win his crown, a secret he had confessed in a rare moment of drunken hubris. It was a secret so vile that its knowledge was a death sentence. She lived in constant terror, knowing that the king's paranoia was not unfounded. He wasn't just guarding his throne, he was guarding his damning secret, and both she and the princess were prisoners of it. Princess Alara grew not in the sunshine, but in the filtered, dusty light of a single, barred window. Her world was a tapestry of lavish confinement, silk bedding, hand-painted walls depicting forests she could never walk in, and dolls with empty, glass eyes for companions. The iron door was the boundary of her existence, its cold, unyielding surface a constant reminder of her isolation. She learned her letters from the queen and her knowledge of the world from the stories her mother whispered. To her, the distant sounds of the city, the rumble of carts, the chime of bells, the roar of the crowd, were like echoes from a mythical land. She was the kingdom's greatest treasure and its most forgotten soul. As she blossomed from a child into a young woman, her beauty became a fragile, tragic thing, like a rare flower blooming in a lightless cave. She yearned for the world beyond the door with an ache that was almost physical. She didn't understand the king's obsessive protection or the queen's constant, sorrowful gaze. She only knew the loneliness, the silence, and the cold, hard finality of the iron door that separated her from life itself. Her destiny was a gilded cage, and she was beginning to understand that there was no key. The secret the queen harbored was a venom that poisoned every moment. The king's rise had not been mere cunning and battlefield prowess. In his desperation for the throne, he had sought out forbidden magic, making a pact with an ancient, shadowy entity that fed on despair. He was promised the crown of Eridor, but the price was unspeakable. The entity demanded the king's most prized possession, not of the present but of the future. It demanded the soul of his firstborn child, to be claimed on her 18th birthday. This was the true reason for the Iron Door. It was not to protect the princess from the world, but to imprison a sacrifice. The king believed he could outwit the darkness, that he could keep Ilara locked away, hidden from the entity that would come to collect its debt. The queen, however, knew the truth. She knew that such pacts could never be cheated. Her sorrow was not just for her loveless marriage, but for her daughter's damned soul. The princess was not a jewel to be bartered for an alliance. She was a debt to be paid in blood and terror. The king's ambition had not just built a kingdom, it had signed his own child's death warrant. The kingdom began to fracture under the weight of the king's tyranny. Famine swept through the provinces as the king's wars consumed every resource. The people, once awed by his strength, now saw him as a rapacious monster. Discontent curdled into rebellion. Whispers in taverns turned into riots in the streets. A peasant army, armed with pitchforks and righteous fury, began to march toward the capital. The king, insulated by his palace walls and his own arrogance, dismissed the threat until the roar of the mob was at his gates. The siege was brutal and swift. The royal guards, tired of fighting for a king who starved their own families, laid down their arms. The great gates were splintered, and the desperate, starving people flooded into the pristine courtyards of the palace, their eyes burning with a hatred reserved for a fallen god. The king's power, built on fear and steel, crumbled like sun-baked earth. His empire was a fantasy, his legacy a joke. As the sounds of shattering glass and furious screams echoed through the halls, the throne he had killed for began its final, violent fall. In the heart of the chaos, as the palace burned, the queen saw her one and only chance. Her life was already forfeit, but perhaps she could save her daughter. She ran towards the princess's tower, the screams of the dying echoing behind her. She found the king standing before the iron door, not defending it but staring at it, a broken man mesmerized by his own monstrous creation. The queen pleaded with him, begging for the key, telling him they had to free Ilara and escape. But the king, lost in his paranoia, saw only betrayal. He accused her of conspiring with the rebels, of wanting to hand his prize over to the mob. Their final argument was not one of words, but of desperation and madness. As the queen lunged for the key hanging from his belt, the king drew a dagger. In the flickering firelight, with the roar of the revolution shaking the very stones beneath them, the king committed his final, unforgivable act. The queen fell to the marble floor, a crimson bloom spreading across her gown, her last sight the cold, impassive iron door that held the child she had died trying to save. The king's downfall was swift and ignominious. When the rebels finally broke through to the royal chambers, they found him not on his throne but standing over the queen's cooling body, muttering senselessly to himself. The sight of their dead queen, a woman they had once adored from afar, shattered any remaining awe they had for the crown. The fury of the mob was absolute. They dragged the king from his sanctuary, stripping him of his fine robes and golden crown. The man who had demanded empires was pulled through the blood-slicked, refuse-strewn halls of his own plundered palace. He who had inspired terror now felt it, raw and primal. There was no trial, no executioner's block. His end was far more visceral. He was torn apart by the very people he had bled dry, his reign ending not with a royal decree, but with a final, choked scream that was swallowed by the roar of the vengeful crowd. His ambition, his power, and his life were extinguished in a storm of mud and blood, a forgotten tyrant consumed by the fire he himself had ignited. After the king's demise, the rebels, drunk on victory and vengeance, remembered the whispered rumors of the hidden princess. They stormed the tower, their torches casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. Using a battering ram, they smashed through the locks of the great iron door, the sound of its destruction echoing like a death knell. There, Cowering in the corner of the lavish room was Princess Ilara. She was nearly a woman, pale and terrified, having heard the screams of her mother's death and her father's execution through the thick metal. The mob paused for a moment, stunned by her ethereal, fragile beauty, but their pity was fleeting. To them she was not a victim. She was the last vestige of the tyrant's bloodline, the living symbol of the oppression they had just overthrown. They saw her fine silk dress and the jewels scattered around her room, and their hunger and hatred returned tenfold. They dragged the weeping, pleading princess from her lifelong prison, out into a world she had only ever dreamed of, only to make it her final nightmare. Her fate was sealed not by a dark pact, but by the simple, brutal cruelty of men. The flames of rebellion eventually died down, leaving a kingdom scarred and a palace in ruins. The story of the cruel king and the beautiful, tragic queen became a cautionary tale told by grandparents to frighten children. But the princess, she was forgotten. Her name, Ilara, was erased from the records. She became a footnote in her father's bloody history, a ghost story whispered by treasure hunters who scavenged the palace ruins. Some said the rebels had shown a moment of mercy and sent her to a convent in a distant land. Others, with a darker glint in their eyes, spoke of a shallow, unmarked grave somewhere beyond the city walls. The iron door itself was melted down for scrap, its purpose lost to time. The kingdom of Eridor eventually healed, ruled by a council of merchants and farmers, but the land itself seemed to hold a memory of the sorrow it had witnessed. A profound sadness clung to the ruined castle, a permanent chill that even the summer sun could not warm. The tragedy was complete, a perfect, unbroken circle of ambition, betrayal, and death, leaving nothing behind but silence. A throne built with blood cannot stand. A legacy written in fear will be erased by hatred. The story of the king, the queen, and the princess is a testament to the corrosive nature of unchecked ambition. The king, in his quest for eternal glory, achieved only eternal infamy, his life's work a pile of ash and rubble. The queen, a pawn in a game of power, found her only freedom in death, a tragic end to a life of silent suffering. And the princess, the innocent, the jewel of the kingdom, was born a prisoner and died a symbol, her only crime the blood that flowed in her veins. The iron door was more than just a physical barrier. It was a monument to the king's paranoia, a cage for the queen's despair, and the tomb of the princess's life. History is not just a record of dates and battles. It is a tapestry woven with human passion, greed, and sorrow. And sometimes, the most haunting stories are the ones that end not with victory, but with the deafening silence of a promise broken and a life stolen away before it ever truly began. History bleeds, and its echoes are written in the cries of kings, queens, and lost princesses. This was the Fear Room. Don't forget to subscribe and like for more dark history tales.